Hi everyone, I am honored and delighted to introduce our guest speaker for the Diversity and Inclusion session at the Human Advantage Conference. Now we will be speaking with Professor Iris Bohnet. Iris is a world leader in behavioral science, currently the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and the co-director of the Women and Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School. She is the author of the award-winning book, we love this book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, and Iris advised governments and companies on the topic around the world. She was appointed to the Gender Equality Advisory Council of the G7 in 2021, if I am correct, and named one of the most influential academics in government and one of the most influential people in gender policy by Apolitical. Professor Bohnet served as academic dean at Harvard Kennedy School from 2011 to 2014 and again from 2018 to 2021. She is also the faculty chair, the co-chair of the executive program Global Leadership and Public Policy for the 21st Century for the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders. So we are very honored, Iris, to have you on board in this great event, the Human Advantage, and welcome to our conference. I am with Anne.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Anne is my colleague and friend, our expert, our champion of the diversity at BVA People at Work Consulting. So again, welcome Iris, and I let Anne asking some key questions.
Hello, Iris. Actually, I interviewed you a few months ago for the podcast Be Good by the BVA Nudge Consulting, and it's great to be interviewing you again. So, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we can say that companies have been doing a lot, especially in the last couple of years. However, things are not moving as fast as we would have hoped. And I was wondering how can behavioral science explain this relative lack of results?
So thank you, Anne. It's lovely to see you again. And thank you, Eric, for having me. And thank you for all the work that you are doing to help us advance the insights from behavioral science, in particular for good. So very happy to be here and happy to talk a bit about the behavioral science and how it can be used for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But Anne, yes, you're right. It is moving slowly. And maybe we shouldn't be too surprised. And I'm saying that for two reasons. I think one, it's not as if we have been working on behavioral science and diversity, equity, and inclusion for 20 years. We have done that for other fields. We've done that for health. We've done that, in financial services. We've done that in education. So it's a relatively young field that we really apply behavioral science to DEI. And secondly, and that is also important, I don't think we have always done it right. And when I say we, I'm using the collective we here. Because to change behavior, as we all know, we need to change the will and the way and of how people behave. And I'm going to start with the way, because that, I think, is the particular strength of behavioral science, where we have lots of insights into how our minds work and lots of insights into how our systems can be biased. But interestingly enough, a lot of work still focuses on changing minds. And as we know, that is just incredibly hard. Now, I'm not going to say it can never work, but I think after the book Nudge and what I would call almost revolution in behavioral science, we know that choice architecture, or as I call it, behavioral design, is just much more promising and can yield results relatively quickly. And still many, many, many companies, and not just companies, also public sector, and civil society organizations still focus on training bias out of our minds. And that could be diversity training, or it could be, newer incarnations of unconscious bias training. And I think the evidence is sobering. And again, maybe not a big surprise for behavioral scientists, because generally in behavioral science, we have not been very good at training bias out of our minds, right? It's incredibly hard, not just in terms of gender or race or disability or other forms of inclusion, but generally we know it's hard to teach people not to be overconfident. It is hard to teach people not to feel loss aversion. It is hard to teach people not to be impacted by anchors. So I think that's the first insight, that we have a toolbox in behavioral science, and the world is using it, but we have to work even harder to help the world see the benefits of debiasing their institutions. And that's hard. I mean, it's hard work to look at your processes, your procedures, your practices. And so maybe not a big surprise that that hasn't happened to the degree that maybe those of us on the screen here or in the room would have hoped for. So that's kind of the way. And I think we'll talk more about specific instruments in a moment. So I'm not going to go deep here. But secondly, I do want to also mention the will. And I'm kind of saying a little bit mea culpa here, because I don't think I have always focused enough on the will. Because one way to describe behavioral economics or behavioral science more generally is to say that we are particularly useful to the world when somebody wants to get from A to B. We're not the ones to say where B is. B might be up here, B might be there, but we have an additional tool for the collective toolbox, and we're helping you kind of reach your goals. Now, in diversity, equity, and inclusion, even the goal setting itself, so the B, actually is up for grabs. And so I've recently turned my attention more to this question of the will, of trying to better understand, when do organizations start to care? And that could be intrinsic motivation. That is not a typical, so starting from the least typical one, that is not a typical motivator. But there are cases where literally somebody had an epiphany and felt like, well, that's just not right. We need to do better at gender equity, at pay equity, at representation of underrepresented groups. That can happen. It sometimes happens because of personal contact. So lots of research on interpersonal contact theory, suggesting that it matters whether we know people who look different from ourselves. So that's one motivator. A second one, and that's where behavioral science has been very strong, but we have only just, I think in recent years, made a real impact in that domain on DEI, and that's social. So social motivation, very important, social norms, social comparisons, etc. And then lastly, again, that's more of a recent phenomenon, extrinsic motivation. And so the older phenomenon, particularly in the United States where I work, has been sex discrimination and lawsuits, or race discrimination lawsuits. Was a motivator for a company kind of to take stock, to understand what happened. Some of this happened because of the Me Too movement, some because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that still happens. But what's new, and that's what I'm saying more recent, is the ESG movement. So for shareholders to focus on environmental, social, and governance factors in performance, and for companies to build in diversity requirements, for example, into their key performance metrics, into their KPIs. Now, again, behavioral scientists would have lots to say about that. Are the incentives big enough? Is it like 2% of your bonus, which is 20% of your total pay? At which point you would probably argue it's not motivationally relevant. But I am just describing this as seeing more of a movement towards thinking more about that motivational piece as well. So we have to work on both the way and the will of behavior change.
And so, focusing on these two, how could you give us a few insights on how to be impactful in diversity, equity, and inclusion using behavioral design? What are the main drivers that can be used?
Yeah, interesting enough, and I always go back to this simple acronym that the Behavioral Insights team in the UK created, EAST. I think it just summarizes in a very easy way some of the key drivers. So EAST stands for, the E stands for easy, the A stands for attractive, S stands for social, and T stands for timely. And maybe I just give you an example of each of those drivers. So easy, I think, is self-explanatory. I think it's part of our DNA as behavioral scientists to focus on making things just simpler for people. And we understand that if we add work, if we add complexity, it's just going to decrease the likelihood that people will follow through with our interventions. So we did something very simple a few years ago. I was called by the Nobel Prize Foundation, and they called me because they were worried about the homogeneity of Nobel Prize winners. So at the time, about 96% of Nobel Prize winners, I think 96 or 94%. So I'm not quite sure now, 94, 96%, but a big percentage of Nobel Prize winners were men. And I was invited then to go to Stockholm and work with the various Nobel Prize foundations on their processes and what might be able to be done. And I also, of course, had to sign an NDA, so I can't disclose many of the things that we discussed. But one thing I can describe, because they themselves wrote about it, and I also arrived with it actually when I got there. Every year, I get a form from the Nobel Prize Foundation inviting me to nominate one person for the Nobel Prize in Economics. And I'm sure many other people in the audience get those forms too. And I noted that they always ask me to nominate exactly one person. And so my first recommendation for the Nobel Prize Foundation was to ask people like me to nominate more than one person. And that's building on some of our own research with Max Bazermans and Alexandra, just as Alexandra van Geen, former doctoral student of mine, just blanked on her first name, but also other people's work on Edward Yang and Katie Milkman and others on making decisions in bundles or making comparative evaluations, where both of our research groups have found that diversity is more likely to emerge when you look at more than one candidate at a time. And that's, that was the idea. And that's the new form. So the new form now asks people like me to nominate 3 people for the Nobel Prize in Economics. Now, having said this, that's an interesting example where I told the Nobel Prize Foundation that, of course, nobody has ever tested that with in their context, right, with the Nobel Prize process. So I couldn't be absolutely sure that this was working because, of course, both the studies that I just mentioned and the studies that they build on have been conducted in the lab and have been very high in internal validity. So I'm always very careful to describe the evidence base that leads to one of my recommendations so that then organizations themselves can make a call whether that feels safe enough for them, to take that risk, so to speak. But that's an example of easy, right? Super easy. Most nominators probably didn't notice that they're now asked to make 3 recommendations. It's just a change of the form. And many, many companies and organizations have done that. On the attraction, certainly economic incentives come to mind, the ones that I described before. That's not a nudge, but I'm just saying the obvious, that financial incentives also do matter. But of course, we can, again, go back to our earlier discussion and also ask ourselves about the motivating part of goals. And as we know, just goal achievement is an attractive thing for people to do. It's part of human psychology, even if the goal doesn't come with financial consequences. And my example here is a lovely initiative, a lovely bottom-up initiative at the BBC where one journalist, Ross Atkins, started the 50-50 project, which now has spread around the world with more than 100 organizations way beyond media having signed up to the project. And the goal is 50-50 representation. Now, in Ross's case, this was actually focused on his own talk show initially. It was totally bottom up, but quite behaviorally informed. They had three principles. They still have three principles. The first one is never compromise on quality. You bring in the best expert. Secondly, of course, you want to diversify. So we want to represent the people who we serve. So this is about our clients, our listeners, our viewers. And we need to be representative of the people we serve. And then thirdly, he totally had the ease in mind. So it couldn't be too hard for them, for their team to do it. And they literally, by hand, counted every evening how many men and women. So they focused on gender first, and now going more broadly, and do ethnicity. But they started with gender, so they literally counted how many men and women they had on the show every evening. And that spread across the BBC and now across the world. So goal setting is important, and the goal that I just described to you is a good example. It has kind of some normative appeal. It's 50-50. That's kind of the world population. It's easy in that you just count. That's not very hard every day. And it's also nice in that it's actually happening every day. It's related to the T. I'm just going to quickly jump to the T in East, that something has to be timely. Right? If the goal happens in 50 years from now and somebody else, and maybe possibly even a machine, kind of counts and it's not relevant for my daily life, it will have much less of an impact. So that is kind of a nice example. And then the S in East is actually also something that happened in the BBC, although I'll give you another example as well. But it was all social norms. It was social comparisons. It was, wow, this can be done. And so, eventually there was a bit of a comparison across programs. Well, my program does it, yours could be too. And but it was always a positive nudging. So never coercion, no threats, no sanctions, but really role modeling and kind of social approval. So social norms are very important. We also, I'm going to actually, now that I realize I'm using another example from the UK, but I know some of us are in London right now, so that might be just okay. But all of you, of course, are familiar with the UK's work on increasing gender diversity in corporate boards that launched in 2011, and with the purpose of having 25% women on corporate boards and the FTSE 100 boards by 2015. Again, it was a goal. It was a soft goal, like the BBC goal. It wasn't a quota. And it worked. And partly it worked because of social pressure, of social comparisons where firms were compared with each other. Partly that was the role of the government. Partly that was the role of the media. Executive search firms were compared with one another, how many women they had placed. So I think the S in East is a particularly important feature of a behavioral designer's collective toolbox. And I'm going to end on the T. I mean, I've already mentioned the T, but I'm going to give you just one other example because I know we're also meeting in Milano. So I thought I'm going to Italy now with a cool study where Michela Carlana actually examined very timely intervention and informed teachers who had to grade Italian students' final exam. So before they go to at the end of high school, before they go to college. And they, what the intervention was very, very simple. They all had to take an implicit association test. And then she informed teachers just before the grading, either how well they did, or just told them, thank you for taking part in the test. So the intervention in the treatment group was you knew how you did an implicit association test, and the control treatment was that you didn't get any information. And she could show that it mattered in teachers' grading, and that it helped decrease the gaps between men and women, but also between native Italians and immigrants. And so that's the timeliness, I think, is the important piece here, that if we had revealed that information, 2 months earlier, it very likely would not have happened. And I'm actually learning from that, and I have learned from that. And I'm now working with, excuse me, with a number of organizations which use exactly this idea before either promotion rounds or performance appraisal rounds, where some companies now have these promotion committees which look at all the people who have been suggested for promotion. And we give them an intervention just beforehand, literally just beforehand, before they start their day, of looking at these promotions. And again, this is not research. This is just an application. I'm hopeful that these immediate interventions can be powerful.
Thank you very much for all these examples and inspiring insights. I have one last question, Iris. Since the release of your book, so Eric mentioned it, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, it was in 2016, sorry. What have you learned? What key topics have you been addressing? I know, for example, that you've been working with multiple tech companies.
Yes, there's so many interesting things. I'm going to start with a French example this time, because I know we have some friends from Paris who are also listening today. A really nice study has been done by Clémentine van Eschenterre, where she looked at the impact of role models in schools again, where they had women with a tech background visit a school for just an hour. And I'm sharing that this intervention because it feels so low cost, and just an hour. And the dependent variable was the track that the students chose. They choose more of an academic science-based track, that they choose more of an academic humanities-based track, or more of a social science-based track in academia. And they could show that exposure, it's a very large-scale experiment, exposure to counter-stereotypical female role models increase the chances that these female students then chose a STEM track. Now, I do think, for example, that's an insight that now has been used quite widely. Did we not know that role models matter? Yes, we did. I think we've always known this, but I do think many, many more organizations are aware that seeing is believing, and that we have to pay attention to who people see in what types of circumstances. It has affected films, has affected media, it has affected books. And again, it's actually important to start in our schools because, as we know, those stereotypes form relatively early, roughly between 4 and 6 years old. So if we can get to those interventions much earlier, then that would be a very good thing. And that's, a bit long-term hope too, that I do think we're much more intentional about how we teach, how we present books, how we present information, the portraits on our walls, the cartoons, etc. So that's just kind of one thing that I've really seen explode. I mean, literally explode, including, in almost all countries like Germany, and I think Germany, Switzerland, and the US, we have very strong NGOs working on diversity in media, whether, again, that's in TV and films or in the print media. So I think that's happening. So that is I think, an interesting development. But the other highlight, or maybe two last ones. But the other highlight I wanted to share with you, that is something I had not anticipated, really, but that shows I'm a 20th century person, is how many tech startups would take our tools and turn them into technology. Literally living east, right? Literally making it easier for users to get this right, including for smaller companies, which might not have a very developed HR or people analytics department, but actually can benefit from HR technology that is already devised. And I'm going to start with the two most recent ones that I've just learned about, and then I'm going to go back to kind of two older ones. But two most recent ones, one is called Equalis, and it is a company in Colombia, in Latin America. And they think, I don't know, but they think they're the first one in this space in Latin America. And they do many of the things that we all know are good things to do. So they start with measuring, with counting, with transparency, with reporting what they find from the companies, but then also advising companies with the tools that we all like on how to de-bias their practices and procedures. Another one that does something quite similar in India is called Serene. Again, also a company I just learned. These are two companies I just learned about in the last month. So typically, I think these days I learn about a new company once a week. And I normally always say yes to a request to meet with them. I don't have a ton of time, but I can give half an hour to everyone. And it's just exciting to see that people take our collective knowledge and turn it into a tool that is then useful for the world. So I'm super excited about those two new companies. But then, of course, I have to go back, way back. That's more like 2015-ish, where Applied spun out of the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. That's probably one of the first, if not the first, HR tool that was very, very much building on behavioral science and very evidence-based, including continuously running and evaluating experiments on their own site, and very focused on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they've built in many of the tools that we all know are kind of interesting, including kind of removing CVs from evaluations, working on work sample tests, doing comparative evaluations, etc. And of course, I should have said that. All of those are primarily focused on the hiring stage. I think I didn't mention that. So all three of them primarily focus on hiring. So that's been super exciting, that I can see scale, in a different way than I foresaw scale, really. And I think that's very exciting. The last thing I just wanted to mention, because you alluded to that, so I have been involved with a group focused on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tech sector. And we came out with a public report called ACT, Action to Catalyze Tech, that I think if you look at it, you'll find very, very based on behavioral science insights. But I think in contrast to much of the work that we all do, and including myself, it tries to be a bit more holistic, kind of thinking about the employee journey in a more holistic way, and then going beyond the employee journey. So including questions of pipeline. So how can we work with schools to make sure that we increase the diversity of our candidate pool already, but then also thinking about the products that we design. So what differences difference make in product design, and what responsibility do we have as designers of the world, whether that's of a computer screen, of software, or literally of a hiring process. And that's been quite interesting in seeing that we might have to push ourselves to this somewhat more ecosystem approach that is a bit more holistic, but also in our case included many different tech firms. Because another argument, of course, is that if we don't change the ecosystem, we just keep stealing people from each other. And as we know, that happens in academia a lot. And certainly as academic dean, I'm one of the culprits of stealing people from others, and people steal people from us. But so we do have to also increase the pool and diversify the pool, whether that's men in HR. I know some of your own work has been focusing on that, or men as in nursing, or women in tech, or even in economics, going back to my own discipline.
Thanks so much, Iris. It is really a wonderful insight and very helpful case studies. I think now it's time to start our roundtable, but I would like to ask one final question to you. If you had one advice to give to Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer to be more efficient and accelerate the desired changes, what would be this advice?
Oh, Eric, it's the one question. But I I'm hoping that the field, diversity, equity, inclusion, can become a field, of that's focusing on the way. I started with the will and the way. That becomes a field of experts who can help organizations get from A to B. I don't think, and that's why I'm focusing on that. I don't think chief diversity officers are normally in a position to, in fact, define where B is going to be. So my advice to chief diversity officers is to collaborate with businesses, with their business departments, as much as they possibly can, to make kind of DEI, kind of the will to change, kind of an integral part of doing business. And I fear that too many chief diversity officers were put into a position where we hope for magic from them, but they weren't actually empowered. They didn't have the resources, the power, the tools to implement the work. So we need the senior leadership of a company to be in the lead, to be in the lead on DEI. And I think the role of the DEI team, whether that's a person or a team, then really is the expertise that they have and nobody else does.
Thanks a lot again. We are impatient to read your new book to come, and a big thank you. So that's it for us, and we start our roundtable.
Thank you so much for having me.